tvshows.com. Thank you for listening, and stay tuned to CILU 102.7 FM.
In 1972, a crack commando unit was sent to prison by a military court for a crime they didn't commit. These men promptly escaped from a maximum security stockade to the Los Angeles underground. Today, still wanted by the government, they survive as soldiers of fortune. If you have a problem, if no one else can help, and if you can find them, maybe you can hire the A-Team.
That was the Zombie Kids remix of the original A-Team theme by Mike Post. Hannibal, the military commander from the A-Team, of course, named after the famous ancient general Hannibal the Carthaginian, who more or less successfully attacked the immortal city of Rome with a madcap guerrilla elephant attack over the Alps. Hats off to generals. I really loved Hannibal from the A-Team when I was a boy. That combination of a kooky character with George Papard's handsome, cynical, old-school theatricality, like he was a pro actor half-heartedly slumming it on network television. And of course, the perpetual implication that even though Howlin' Mad Murdoch was intentionally exploring madness as the quote-unquote insane one on the team, that Commander Hannibal was the truly crazy one, especially when, as they said, he was on the jazz. A euphemism for some kind of military flow state, resembling the unpredictable improvisation of jazz music, I suppose. Maybe every military commander is crazy in that special kind of way that made me feel so wonderfully immortal and unendingly capable when I was 8 years old. Maybe not. Speaking of being 8 years old, 8 is a very specific number, as I'm sure you will agree. It's also one of the 10 most mystical numbers and easily in my top 100 of numbers. Let's face it, it's a number. It's one of the numbers. An infinitesimal and very particular subset of all numbers in general. And do numbers in general or anything in general have anything in common with military generals? Probably not, but on the other hand, probably. You're listening to CILU 102.7 FM, and this is a show. I'm the host. Our topic today is something, some sort of thing. It's a very general show today. We'll be discussing generals and stuff, and by stuff, I mean any other insanely general subject matter. How general? Well, as general as your genes. That's right, folks. You have something or other very general in common with your blood relations. You have these little teams of viruses that are integrated together and live inside the busy civilization of your cells. These teams are called genes. And you don't just share them with your family. You have most of them in common with all the other creatures on this planet. Genes are actually quite general. Most things have roughly the same DNA. It's not a blueprint, it's a toolkit. You can build lots of different things with the same general toolkit. It's generic stuff, gene-eric stuff. Turns out it isn't so far-fetched for an eyeball to evolve on this planet. It could be a little more far-fetched than we currently understand, but it's a lot less far-fetched than we used to think it was, because you don't have to randomly mutate all the bits of an eyeball and find another creature with an eyeball to mate with. Your DNA toolkit already has a bunch of general routines built in. You fire a signal and send for the optic sensor improv team, and they improvise up an optic sensor within whatever situation is going on. Maybe they roll it into the spherical organ squad, or layer it over the skin, or hotwire it onto the end of a stalk. Maybe they build 1 or 2 or 64, and then they go home. You didn't have to individually work out the whole thing randomly from scratch in the peculiar circumstances of your given DNA pattern and niche. You just had to let your environmental conditions, your symbiotes, and your inherited epigenetic modifications throw switches that tell the photon detector squad to install a photon detector. Mix and match, evo-devo, generic parts, genes passed on through the genitals, regenerating the species, generating the generations, and generally shared among beings. Even up to the point where a general civilized society needs to have its genes protected by a military force in which all the captains are overseen by a captain general, which is where the term comes from. The figure of a general makes excellent cinematic fodder, as I'm sure you will agree. A general is a borderline superhuman with their discipline, cunning, sensitivity, insensitivity, strategy, tactics, ability to sleep anywhere, her aura of command, his political savvy, her deep reading of the military classics of the ancient world, skin in the game, fearlessness, clarity, etc., etc. When everyone else cringes with fear or sympathy in the midst of conflict, the general comes in to yell at everyone, and we cheer! That's how you get things done, by God! That's how you get things moving. But when everyone else is tense, unfocused, unfeeling, then the general suddenly takes time for the lowliest soldier, time to hear the pleas of the locals or the neglected advisors, and everyone cheers again! That's how you get things done, by God! Generals win either way, in victory or defeat. They aren't just generally in charge, they are also generally general universal human beings, seemingly advanced beyond the average in countless ways. But the Achilles heel of generals is their vanity, and the Achilles heel of innocent civilians is also the vanity of generals. How many uninvolved, uncomprehending custodians of local ancient lore and lineage were wiped out by General Alexander the so-called Great when he went on his teen-killing rampage across the Near East to put his name up on billboards everywhere? That gives you some sense of the problem. A little thing inside generals that sometimes breaks and becomes good cinema. The problem, as you will know from having seen any movie about generals ever, is that they need to win. They think they can win, and they won't stop. They convince themselves to keep going, and they convince everyone else too. The scent of glory leads them to trample the beautiful flowers. At first, it's a good thing. You don't get to be a general unless you've done some impressive stuff. You won some unwinnable battles. You surprised everyone. You seized victory from Spielberg's jaws of defeat. You improvised unknown strategies. You cut through the noise. You inspired people and faced down your enemies. But now your hubris is salaciously eyeing the wax wings of Icarus on a sunny day. How will you know when to stop when every great thing about you came from ignoring everyone else and all the emotions that told you to stop in the past? Trixie, 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 Trixie. That was Sergei Prokofiev's Dance of the Nights from the soundtrack of the half-good film War Machine about a U.S. general in Afghanistan. And then Michael Dorost's remix of Stars and Stripes Forever, the end song from the original movie version of Joseph Heller's novel Catch-22, starring Orson Welles as General Dreidel. I'm Layman Pascal on CILU 102.7 FM, and this is a general episode. Now listen, generals are very peculiar, very particular, very precise people. They are unlike the rest of the troops. They are a distinct minority. They are the inverse of soldiers in general. A general soldier doesn't have what it takes to be a general, but possibly that's because he treats his own experience too personally, whereas a general treats everyone's experience very generally and can therefore send 100,000 troops to their slaughter for a good reason that would seem like a terrible reason to a specific soldier. This kind of trans-oppositional interweaving of terminology makes me wonder what generality really means. Why do they call them generals? What in general does it mean for anything to be in general? Well, perhaps we could generalize an answer from some examples of very general things. What sort of things are the most general? What sorts of things nominally include the greatest diversity of examples within their specific categorical abstractions? Let's brainstorm. What about form? Form is pretty general. It could be any kind of form: square, oblong, fractal, humanoid, toroidal, gazillion-dimensional, Riemannian, Hilbert space. You really can't imagine a place or time that isn't completely pervaded by forms. Even relatively empty space is shaped in relation to the objects that you are distinguishing it from. Could there have been a time before form in the early universe? Well, on the face of things, no. Not if there was anything there real enough to inculcate the next moment of reality from which we descend. Anything that real probably has a form. Forms inform the forms that follow: formicity, formalness, formativity. That's a pretty general thing, as I'm sure you will agree. Or what about being? That's pretty general. There are, in general, a lot of beings in the universe, and their shared abstract property of beingness is perhaps even more general. Many ridiculously hatted Himalayan sects seem to worship the slippery facticity of the ultra-existential isness of all things, as I'm sure you will agree. The property of merely existing is applicable to all things that exist, if it is appropriate to call that a property. And if it is appropriate to call beingness a property of all beings, then what's the zoning legislation on that? Can I subdivide it, build a second house, sell, and keep the original? Or does someone else have a monopoly on this property of being? Maybe the title deed is still in Heidegger's name. After all, he wrote a tediously brilliant phenomenological discursion on being and time back in the day. We have, he said, like the Greeks before us, he said, focused, he said, too much or only on the beings that exist or might exist, and not enough on the beingness of whatever may or may not exist. Even our own being, he said, lies relatively untapped at the core of the clearing of our own event. We do what one does, but when we really assimilate the possibility of the end of all possibilities, then we gain a smattering of authenticity and start to do what we do. Well, Heidegger said it, but it's a marvelously Gurdjieffian statement in terms of death, being, and the ability to do. Although how much existential beingness that old farm-obsessed half-Nazi General Heidegger managed to cultivate in himself is a dubiosity at best. Either way, as I'm sure you will agree, being is a pretty generic quality, a candidate for generality. What about consciousness, though? Is it very general? That's a slippery one, precious. My internal image of consciousness is like a kind of general field of inner and outer perception that is instanced in every waking encounter, but seemingly exists around and before each of them. That's kind of general. I certainly don't run into anything or have any experience without consciousness. Whenever I show up, it's already there. So it must be everywhere, unless it just gets there a second before I do. I mean, it does look kind of winded and confused when I show up, as if it just arrived a moment earlier, but I'll give consciousness the benefit of the doubt and pretend it is everywhere I am. That is, I would do that unless I took neuropsychology into account, because what if consciousness is only a very small and limited part of my experience and intelligence? What if most of my encounters are not conscious, at least not in the sense of waking recognition? I don't notice most of my cognitive operations and certainly don't have access to all of my emotions, motives, and reasoning all the time, so maybe consciousness isn't general enough unless we generalize it to include everything we normally call unconscious and subconscious, but then where are we? As I'm sure you will agree. Do I really have to be conscious in order to detect anything? Is that what consciousness is? My potential detection of anything? Or can I unconsciously detect things? And what are things? Are they limited to detectable things? Or are there things that aren't just not detected, but are actually undetectable? Is that actuality a possibility? Even the informational effect of an electron upon a single photon counts as a measurement, an observation, an observer in quantum mechanics. That's pretty small, but does it mean that everything is always detectable at any scale, no matter how small? Could there be things so small they lack detectability? Are objects smaller than the Planck length not detectable in principle? Or must they be, in order to be conceived of as existing, already detected at their own scale by something? Some other ones of them, perhaps, their many worlds peer group of multiple narrative instances of the so-called same particle? It seems solipsistic to say that things are only detected things. Surely the most general experience of everyone and of rationality itself is that undetected things get detected. But perhaps that only means they were being detected by something other than you before you showed up to detect them. Is there an infinitesimal pre-detectability that stands prior to the qualities and the quantities relativistically invoked as data by any detection event that occurs at any scale? Is the phrase undetectable object an oxymoron, or is it the most primitive truth of the cosmos? No, don't tell me, I'm keen to guess. And I guess the smart money is probably on every real thing being detectable, but no real thing necessarily being detected by any particular other real thing, and no undetectable things being real, but the jury's out on that. Nevertheless, as I'm sure you will agree, detectability is a pretty general property. And speaking of general properties, I might have forgotten the most important generality of all: the people of Rome. That was Jeff Beal with the theme song from HBO's Rome. Speaking in general about generalities, we may need to consider the gods. Not just of ancient Rome, but of all archaic empires and secret dreams. I know, you thought you put all that behind you, like your confusing emotions about breaking up with your first boyfriend, but Ravinder didn't die. You still see him on Facebook once in a while, and like him, the gods linger on at the shifting informational periphery of our current incarnation of so-called culture. Gods, though, is perhaps counterintuitively a very monotheistic way of thinking about them. Once you have one god, you might retroactively assume that other people were worshiping some version of a god, and if it's plural, then they were worshiping many gods with strange foreign names like children believing in superheroes. And then atheists retroactively apply monotheistic logic to monotheism, and all the gods disappear as if they were just cartoonish placeholders for a science that had not yet emerged. Those naive, damned fools, as I'm sure you will agree. But what if gods is the wrong word? What if they were saying in their language a recognition of the various powers or principles that seem to organize the mind and the universe? After all, if we take the simplest, decent step in understanding and translate their words into our own language, we find that spirit of nature makes a lot more sense than a legendary character named Dionysus. Just like fear being the offspring of aggression is totally rational unless we say it in Greek that Phobos was the child of Ares. As soon as we charitably apply full translation, the idea of gods starts dissolving into an idea of generic principles of life. Sure, they dramatized and personified these principles artistically, but it's not superstitious or irrational to speak about love, power, wisdom, lady luck, attractiveness, the heavens, the earth, the winds, creativity, the flesh, the well-formed one, etc. They're partly poetic, but also pretty straightforward, rational, abstract concepts, generic concepts, general concepts. You think Raven is a shape-shifting trickster god I worship, but the generalized experience of all ravens is a perfectly reasonable thing to use to organize my conscious and unconscious reasoning processes. And the general raven is clever, crafty, tricky, taking different forms. Sure, I'd be a fool to worship the gods, but I'd be an equal or worse fool not to organize my feelings and actions in accordance with the great generalities of the world. And what is the great so-called pagan pantheon out of which science and philosophy evolved as if by no accident, if not a biolinguistic resonance chart about the generalities themselves? Leading from the generalized spirit of plants and animals and people up through the general motivations of natural forces right up to the most general possible things like His Majesty Thingness himself. Amen. So when we ask if Socrates or Caesar believed in the gods, we might be asking a weirdly distorted and off-base kind of question that even sabotages our own health and well-being. I imagine the kind of world-building potency exhibited by such world historical individuals comes in part from their alignment with the harmonized mandala of the forces of being. Unless they were appropriately related by whatever means, and whatever that means, with all the generalities of their time and place, how else could they move up the middle and wield that special leverage that turns the wheel of the world? That's a kind of piety in my book, a kind of faithfulness, even or especially if it seems radical at the time. General Caesar claimed to be descended from love and chosen by power, Venus and Jupiter. He was the special favorite of two generalities. Maybe the same could be said for General Napoleon, who wasn't just a militaristic authoritarian, although he was, but who also legitimately seemed to represent a leap forward in culture toward more sane legal codes, better science, more internationalism, better philosophy, more rational institutions, and the metric system. Maybe Napoleon, like General Caesar, was dynamite. So here's some music from Napoleon Dynamite.
CILU is sponsored in part by the students of Lakehead University, our listeners, and our sponsors. At this time, we would like to thank the following sponsors for their continuous support.
The Thunder Bay Community Auditorium. Find them at tvca.com to purchase tickets and find out all of the details on their upcoming events. Joey's Restaurant, a tasty little place for seafood, located at 595 Arthur Street West. Visit them Tuesdays for all-you-can-eat fish and chips, Thursdays for $4 fish tacos, and kids eat free Saturdays. Some conditions apply. Dental Hygiene Smiles at 137 North McKellar, a community dental hygiene clinic dedicated to providing dental hygiene care to help you achieve good oral health. Find out about their student rates by calling 286-1133 or online at dentalhygienesmiles.com.
to pay. I heard he works in the robotics trade. Must make more money than I have ever made. He drives the newest model motorbike. When he speeds it hits you hard. He has a body that I'm sure you like. Leather jacket and electric tights.
I want you to remember that no bastard ever won war by dying for his country. He won it by making the other poor dumb bastard die for his country. And then all this stuff you heard about America not wanting to fight, wanting to stay out of the war, is a lot of horse dung. Americans traditionally love to fight. All real Americans love the sting of battle. When you were kids, you all admired the champion marble shooter, the fastest runner, big league ball players, the toughest boxers. Americans love a winner and will not tolerate a loser. Americans play to win all the time. I wouldn't give a hoot in hell for a man who lost and laughed. That's why Americans have never lost and will never lose a war. Because the very thought of losing is hateful to Americans. Now, an army is a team. It lives, eats, sleeps, fights as a team. This individuality stuff is a bunch of crap. The bilious bastards who wrote that stuff about individuality for the Saturday Evening Post don't know anything more about real battle than they do about fornicating. Now, we have the finest food and equipment, the best spirit, and the best men in the world. You know, by God, I actually pity those poor bastards we're going up against. By God, I do. We're not just going to shoot the bastards. We're going to cut out their living guts and use them to grease the treads of our tanks. We're going to murder those lousy Hun bastards by the bushel. Now, some of you boys, I know, are wondering whether or not you'll chicken out under fire. Don't worry about it. I can assure you that you will all do your duty. The Nazis are the enemy. Wade into them. Spill their blood. Shoot them in the belly. When you put your hand into a bunch of goo that a moment before was your best friend's face, you know what to do.
Well, inspirational and disturbing stuff from General Patton in the body of George C. Scott right after Figure with New Mate from Napoleon Dynamite. This is CILU 102.7 FM, and I'm the host of A Show. When I was a kid, I was always confused by a sign that said General Paint Store. I avoided that place because I always only needed specific colors. What would I need General Paint for, I wondered, and what does it look like? Gray? Transparent? Secretly all colors like the white robe of Saruman? Saruman. But perhaps I'm being a little facetious because paint doesn't really matter much in my universe. You know, I don't have any similar conundrums about general well-being, eudaimonium, as Aristotle called it. And while I generally dislike Aristotle and consider him to be the key figure in disrupting the true spiritual philosophy of Socrates and his devout disciple Plato, replacing that with academic intellectual opinioning and institutionalized academic habits that eventually bring the entire enterprise of philosophy into justified disrepute among the masses, nevertheless, I love his concern for the general well-being, in which all the spirits, the eudaimonia, are rejoicing together by virtue of their harmony. That's the kind of thing a civilization needs. It's also what an army needs. The U.S. Army is, by historical standards, almost a nation of its own. And that nation has done impressive things. It's arguably a more intelligent, more competent, more ethical organization than the rest of the United States, and it's always experimenting with how it can get better. Brigadier General Rhonda Cornum, the only female ex-prisoner of war currently serving, is director of the Army's Comprehensive Soldier Fitness Program, the CSF. And like Eleanor of Aquitaine and Queen Boadicea before her, she embodies what it takes both mentally and physically to remain resilient and optimistic during traumatic times. She spearheaded the introduction of positive psychology into the U.S. military. Soldiers are fragile, weak, and unreliable things unless they have good relationship skills, focused minds, positive emotions, and high degrees of psychological resilience. Yes, we're talking about super soldiers, the true future of the Republic. We need, General Rhonda said, to build psychological resilience and psychological fitness the same way we need to build physical fitness. Good on you, Rhonda. And, interestingly, some of the groups that work with brain scans to retrain traumatized soldiers have said that male brains survive physical trauma better because they're better at isolating the stimuli and keeping the trauma from spreading through most of the brain, while female brains are more interconnected, and so trauma tends to spread everywhere. However, that same increased interconnection makes them better in principle at juggling the complex, wide-ranging variables of things like efficiency, politics, well-being, strategy, etc. So from the point of view of corrective neuroscience, men make better frontline soldiers and women make better generals. Or rather, masculinized and feminized brains exhibit this distinction. Just because you have a Y chromosome or a pair of testicles doesn't mean you necessarily have a male brain. These things are highly variable.
I am the very model of a modern major general. I've information, vegetable, animal, and mineral. I know the kings of England, and I quote the facts historical from Marathon to Waterloo in order categorical. I'm very well acquainted too with matters mathematical. I understand equations both for simple and quadratical. About binomial theorem, I'm teeming with a lot of news. Lot of news. Got it. With many cheerful facts about the square of the hypotenuse. With many cheerful facts about the square of the hypotenuse. With many cheerful facts about the square of the hypotenuse. With many cheerful facts about the square of the hypotenuse. I'm very good at integral and differential calculus. I know the scientific names of beings, animalculus. In short, it matters vegetable, animal, and mineral. I am the very model of a modern major general. In short, it matters vegetable, animal, and mineral. He is the very model of a modern major general. In fact, when I know what is meant by mammillon and ravelin, when I can tell at sight a Mauser rifled from a javelin, when such affairs as sorties and surprises I'm more wary at, and when I know precisely what is meant by commissariat, when I have learned what progress has been made in modern gunnery, when I know more of tactics than a novice in a nunnery, in short, when I've a smattering of elemental strategy. Strategy. Oh, my word, that's a hard one, isn't it? Wait a minute.
Allergy.
Got it. You'll say a better major general has never sat at For my military knowledge, though I'm plucky and adventurous, has only been brought down to the beginning of the century, but still in matters vegetable, animal, and mineral, I am the very model of a modern major general. But still in matters vegetable, animal, and mineral, he is the very model of a modern major general.
Can you do it one more time?
Certainly.
And can you do it really fast?
What's this? In fact, when I know what is meant by mammal on a reveling, when I can tell a side of mouth arrived from a javelin, when such affairs as sorties and surprises I'm aware at, and when I know precisely what is meant by commissariat. When I have lumber prickers to be made in Montgomery, when I know more of Texas than an office in an honorary, and show when I have a smattering of elemental strategy, you'll say better make Generals never ride a horse! For my military knowledge, the right lackey and adventure has only been brought down to the beginning of the century, but still a matter vegetable, animal, and mineral. I'm the very battle of the body being a general!
John Cameron doing Gilbert and Sullivan's Modern Major General from the Pirates of Penzance. Generally speaking, is everything uncertain? Is everything relative? That would make relativity pretty general. That would be a general relativity, I guess. However, if everything is relative, then at least one thing is absolute, the fact that everything is relative. And if there's one absolute, why not a few more? Maybe you can't actually logically believe that everything is relative, and that's probably why Einstein originally called his theory the invariance model. Measurements are only relative if the speed of light is absolute and doesn't vary. What about uncertainty, though? Is that very general? I certainly don't know about most things, but I guess that's a kind of certainty about myself. I'm told by my friend Doug, who's transitioning and lives in a kind of bunker. It's not a house, Doug. It's a concrete hole in the ground that squirrels urinate on. Anyway, Doug says the Heisenberg uncertainty principle is absolutely not about the fact that you can change things when you measure them, although that's true. The uncertainty principle is about the non-specificity of particle data. It's not that we don't know about the particle. It's that the particle acts like several particles at the same time. If you check that particle for some bit of information, some information pair that's always conjoined, like momentum and position, well, you find that if you nail one of the measurements, you have to face up to the multiplicity, the range, the spread outness of the other measurement. If you find that a particle is at one exact spot, then it's also kind of going at several speeds, and if you know exactly how fast it's going, you can guarantee it's at several spots at the same time. The information is more general than you would like. If you make one thing very particular, you make something else very general. A specific velocity means a general location, a wide range or variance of spots where it really is. That's not uncertainty. We're actually much more certain because the math tells us that the information is more generalized, and we can use that with great certainty. Heisenberg called it, according to Doug's bastardized German skills, Ungenauigkeit, inexactness, and today they call it Unscharfe, blurredness or fuzziness. It's not uncertainty. It's spread over a range. We're completely certain that it is in a couple of different spots. Hashtag Hugh Everett, hashtag Robert Anton Wilson.
Generals gathered in their masses, just like witches at black masses. Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction. In the fields of bodies burning, darkness, world stops turning as you hear the bodies burning.
the power. And as God has struck the hour, day of judgment, God is calling. On their knees, the war pigs crawling, begging mercies for their sins. Satan laughing spreads his wings. Oh Lord, yeah.
Generals gather in their masses, just like witches at black masses. That was Cake's cover of War Pigs, the song of which was the outro music for the movie 300, Rise of an Empire, about the Athenian general Themistocles, who fought off the Persian navy, and then Rolf Kent's Desert Ride from the soundtrack to Men Who Stare at Goats. The Men Who Stare at Goats is a slightly funny movie based on the true story of a U.S. general who empowered people under his command to develop the New Earth Army, which experimented with wielding psychic powers and spiritual sentiments as a key part of establishing world peace with super soldiers. Now, what's the most general of all things? Maybe it's sets. That's what Doug thinks. The French philosopher Alain Badiou postulates that sets are basic and therefore that multiplicity, a set of things, is more basic than unity. Our ancestors seem to think that everything began with the one, but that was anchored in their primitive maths. If we take contemporary math seriously, we might decide that every one thing is always a oneification, a grouping of things, of some things, into a set. You always start with a more than one thing and then do something to it in order to get a oneness. One is a set of some things that already were. So one is the more particular condition, a constraint upon the generality of the multiple. The general condition is manyness. Even nothingness is a special kind of multiplicity, as I'm sure you will agree. Or maybe non-locality. What could be more general than non-locality? It's not even specifically anywhere. It's non-local. It's everywhere else instead. In physics, of course, a locality is a region in which information about physical changes can proliferate by contact at any speed less than the speed of light and gravity. Just in that area where I can kick a ball, I can get stung by or sting a bee, two bullets can collide in midair as they often do. These things are possible because they are very close to each other. They pass on energy directly, like two relay runners passing a baton. They couldn't pass that baton if they were too far apart. Too far apart is non-local. On the other hand, isn't all that other non-local space just really a bunch of other localities? Isn't localness the main feature of every part of non-localness? And isn't there even a little bit of non-locality even within every locality? I mean, how close do you actually have to be to count as touching? Close enough, but not perfectly close, am I right? There's always a vanishingly sliver of a gap. So what, though? You think you've logically demonstrated that locality and non-locality are ontologically indistinct from each other? What are you going to do? Call the presses? No one cares. You might as well be pointing out systemic racism. Speaking generally, though, whatever I can give an example of is general, because to give an example is to convert a generality into a particularity. That's why we might say that something like fields are general. In physics, a field, like a magnetic field or an electrical field, is not located just around the magnet. It's located everywhere in various degrees. The degrees are strong near the magnet, yes, and very weak 3 galaxies away, but these fields are ubiquitous. The actual charges, like the electron, are local wiggles, seemingly, instances of the general field. We've generalized the electron. Thank you, Faraday and Maxwell, for generalizing electricity, and maybe that's where the name General Electric came from, as I'm sure you will agree. Philosophers, those luminous distinction workers, have always been obsessed by the particular and the general. Partly, I think, because philosophers are usually people who develop early in their formal cognition, start thinking about general categories when they are very young. It becomes second nature to them. Thinking about whether whales are fish and how beings relate to being itself leads them to other questions like, how are we to best participate in the global environment, through our generality or through our particularity? For example, how does a Kurdish shoemaker become a citizen of the world? Does he downplay his unique Kurdishness and turn up his general human individuality? Or does he amplify his ethnicity and try to become one of the world's Kurds? Should he go to an international conference of professionals in general, or to an international conference of shoemakers particularly, or to a very special conference just for Kurdish shoemakers with mutton chop sideburns? Should he generalize himself as opposed to being trapped in his lesser particularity, or should he double down on his particularity as if that were already the best way to participate in a general condition in which particularity is already embedded? What's more universal, your specificity or your abstraction? Or maybe your philosophy goes even further. Kierkegaard said something like, hey, because faith is the opposite of reason, you can have the most faith only in the most unreasonable thing, which for him was Christianity. He was a Christian because it contained a complete logical contradiction between the universal and the particular. The all-powerful, omnipresent, eternal God thing was somehow exactly the same as only one mortal being in one location at one moment of history. That's almost Zen-like ridiculousness. There's actually a Zen koan about a master who comes in from hiking near the monastery and tells his students that on his walk, he found the one place where omnipresence could go. It's like saying the whole of reality is exactly and only 2 feet wide. If you keep pondering and wrestling with impossible contradictions between the specific and the general, maybe you'll have some kind of Zen epiphany, or a Christian epiphany, or perhaps just a general epiphany of some kind. And are epiphanies powered by some general energy, something kundalini-ish or kundalicious, a generalized energy we generally associate even with our genitals, whether we regenerate there a new species, new bodies, or produce something extra in ourself, a new consciousness, an energy in us so general that it is simultaneously something very personal about your body and at the same time something utterly abstract about the whole universe? The impersonal, the impartial is often sought in human affairs, and especially in developmental or spiritual affairs. It is as if greater categorical abstraction was somehow more true and morally superior. But why suppose that the features of your identity that exist before you were born, or in general, are better than the ones that appeared recently, temporarily, and specifically? Why would the great being of all beings be better than any individual being? An awful lot of people seem to have the impression that spiritual development is a process of becoming less personal, more impersonal, less selfish, more altruistic, less local, more non-local, less responsive to particular events, and more generally balanced, or sattvic, as they say. Well, we don't love it when our gurus have a special relationship with one of their disciples. We prefer messiahs who treat everyone equally, generically. Impersonal love, not personal love. We might even prefer them to focus on the generalized background of consciousness rather than any particular contents of consciousness. We like to hear them say they are one with everything, or that they are nothing special, or that they cannot even be distinguished from the rest of reality or the rest of us. Why do we get off on impersonality so much? Is it because the universal is a transcendental challenge to our isolated egoic selfishness? Maybe. Or is it on the contrary because in our daily lives we are always selling ourselves short, not being authentic, not being personal enough, being someone rather than being ourselves? Maybe our fantasy of a saint is someone who does the regular old thing we do all the time, but even more intensely. Maybe we project our failure to be truly personal onto them and then pretend they're challenging us to be even more abstract than we actually are. But what would the alternative be? The ungeneral, the anti-general, the hyper-personal, a unique wisdom rather than universal wisdom? Yeah. From 2017's War Machine with Brad Pitt playing a thinly veiled version of General Stanley McChrystal leading the coalition troops in Afghanistan, here's the John Spencer Blues explosion. But I'm Layman Pascal, and you've been listening to a general episode of the Cinematic Asylum on CILU 102.7 FM.
Copperfin Credit Union is Northwestern Ontario's largest locally owned credit union, where we work with you to provide the financial solutions that meet your goals. At Copperfin, ownership has its perks. We put our members first by sharing profits, giving back to the communities we serve, and by providing branches with your convenience in mind. Experience the perks online at any of our 7 branches or access one of the thousands of ding-free ATMs across Canada. Copperfin Credit Union. Life forward.
Do you need to talk to a social worker for assistance? Make an appointment or drop into the Brodie Street Library every Thursday afternoon from 1 to 4 p.m. or the Waverley Resource Library on the last Tuesday of each month from 1 to 4 p.m. For more info, contact Joanne Boucher from Alpha Court at 627-4149 or email her at jboucher, that's J-B-O-U-C-H-E-R, at alphacourt.ca.
CILU is supported in part by the students of Lakehead University, our sponsors, and our listeners. At this time, we would like to thank the following sponsors for their continuous support.
The Outpost, Lakehead University's pub, full-service restaurant, and live music venue. Find them on Facebook to stay up to date on all the happenings during the school year, like Taker Tuesdays and Pub Night Thursdays.